from Mississauga-Brampton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise today and speak in support of the motion put forward by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change for the second reading of Waste-Free Ontario Act. A minister who is very dedicated, very engaged, and very passionate about fighting climate change and creating jobs. Mr. Speaker, Bill 151, if passed, would recover resources, reduce waste, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, fight climate change, and as our minister said in his speech, it would also establish a circular economy. I would like to expand on overview of Bill 151. If this proposed legislation is passed, it would enact two acts. Number one, reducing waste, and number two, replacing existing programs operated under the Waste Diversion Act 2002. And if this proposed legislation is passed, producers will be accountable in full in recovering resources and reducing waste associated with their product and packaging. And this legislation would also create a new oversight body known as Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority to oversee the implementation of new producer responsibility model. And the authority would be equipped with new powers, new compliance, new enforcement tools with enhanced oversight and accountability. Mr. Speaker, this proposed act would also enable our government to issue policy statements to support the interest. It would require ministries, municipalities, producers, and others to perform in a manner that is consistent with those policies. The second act would ensure that existing waste diversion programs can be smoothly transitioned into a new producer responsibility model. Mr. Speaker, now the question arises why there is a need for such legislation, why it is important. Ontario's recycling programs have been recognized internationally. Almost all Ontarians, 97% of our households, have access to Blue Box program. In residential sector, 47% of household waste is diverted from landfill. But the rate for the rest of the economy is much, much lower. Existing waste diversion programs cover only 15% of Ontario's waste stream. And over the last decade, Mr. Speaker, our overall waste diversion rate has stalled at 25%. As a result, more than 12 million tons of waste is generated annually in Ontario. And every year, approximately $1 billion worth of recoverable materials is lost to landfills across Canada. So it's very clear that more needs to be done. So that is why Bill 151 is very, very important, and it is intended to enable a shift to a circular economy which would increase resource recovery and waste reduction in Ontario. And in this proposed legislation, the new model, as I said earlier, would be a producer responsibility framework that would make producers environmentally accountable and financially responsible for their products and packaging at end of life. The province would establish requirements that producers must meet to achieve desired outcomes for designated products and packaging. And these requirements would apply to responsible producers and create a more level playing field. Requirements would be set out in regulation, and producers would be able to decide how best to meet them. Mr. Speaker, we want all Ontarians to have a reliable, accessible, convenient services like the Blue Box and other waste diversion programs. To provide this access, the government have the ability to set consumer convenience and accessibility standards. The proposed legislation would support increased consumer participation. And this could include geographically based standards to ensure services are provided across the province. The province could also require producers to develop promotion and education programs to support consumer awareness. And in this proposed legislation, we will have a strategy to implement our broader approach, which is set out in our draft strategy for waste-free Ontario and building the circular economy. And that draft strategy would be a roadmap to help Ontario to leverage planning, policy, and economic tools to reduce the amount of waste generated in Ontario, improve resource recovery, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the waste sector. And together, Mr. Speaker, the proposed legislation and strategy would boost the recycling in the industrial, commercial, and institutional sectors. They would further foster innovation in product and packaging design. And they would incent companies to look for ways to make their recycling processes more economical and stay competitive. They would allow full producer responsibility for the Blue Box program and removing the financial burden on municipal property taxpayers. And under the strategy, the plan would be developed to reduce the amount of organic materials going into landfills. And this proposed legislation would have a huge consumer impact also. How it would benefit Ontario household. Under Ontario's proposed approach, consumers would continue to have convenient access to recycling through the Blue Box. In fact, we expect the public will be able to recycle more material than they can today because producers would be required to meet collection standards for more materials. And the proposed legislation would make producers responsible for providing customers with clear information about how to manage their end-of-life products, including drop-off sites. In a more general way, Ontario households would benefit from the proposed legislation because our approach will be good for the environment and the economy. There will be huge economic benefits also if Bill 151 is passed. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. It would boost the economy by recovering more resources from more waste material and create jobs in the waste diversion sector. Our government's proposed approach would provide a range of tools to ensure valuable resources are recovered, reused, and reintegrated into our Ontario's economy, which our minister said in his speech would be known as a circular economy. In fact, according to Conference Board of Canada's recent report, recovering just 60% of waste materials could create 13,000 jobs and contribute $1.5 billion in gross domestic product to Ontario. Recovering resources from waste can create 7 jobs for every 1,000 tons of waste captured and will generate 10 times more jobs than if that waste were sent to landfills. And if passed, this proposed legislation would provide producers with the flexibility to manage waste in the most cost-efficient and cost-effective manner. Since shifting cost of recovering products and packaging from municipal taxpayers to producers would also help municipalities, and municipalities could save more than $100 million annually and this will further improve the sustainability of municipal services. And there are huge environmental benefits as well. The proposed Waste-Free Ontario Act would help us reach our greenhouse gas reduction targets and achieve the goals in our climate change strategy. Landfills have an environmental as well as an economic cost. When organic waste and other biodegradable materials such as paper are disposed of in landfills, they begin to break down, and this creates emissions such as methane, which has a global warming potential 25 times greater than that of carbon dioxide. Greenhouse gas emissions from Ontario's waste increased by 25% between 1990 and 2012 as the waste in Ontario landfills has increased. In fact, emissions from waste sector, including release of methane from landfills, accounted for 5% of total emissions in Ontario in 2013. Ontario currently avoids adding 2.2 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions to our air every year through our waste diversion programs. This is equivalent to taking almost 500,000 cars off the road each year. And recycling uses less energy and produces fewer greenhouse gas emissions than creating products with virgin materials. It also avoids the environmental impact of activities such as the extraction of raw materials. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, there will be benefits for the municipalities also, since the cost is shifting to the producer from municipal taxpayers. It would save money for municipalities and improve the sustainability of municipal services. And municipalities would realize additional savings as more materials are designated for new producer responsibility approach. For example, such as fluorescent bulbs and tubes, etc. And Bill 151 would also set a clear process for addressing disputes. The proposed legislation requires dispute resolution provisions to be included in contracts between producers and other parties, such as municipalities, in order to address disputes related to services and compensation. Mr. Speaker, since there will be a transition from the proposed legislation, if it is passed, to replace all the existing programs. So the proposed act was developed in response to what we heard from across Ontario. And one thing we heard very loud and clear, that we needed to ensure a smooth and orderly transition of the existing programs to ensure the interruption of current services to Ontarians. The Waste Diversion Transition Act under Bill 151 would facilitate the smooth transition of existing waste diversion programs to a new producer responsibility approach. And the transition process would be based on 4 principles. Number 1, government would lead the overall transition process. Second, each program would have a customized transition process. Third, extensive stakeholder consultations would be conducted. And finally, Ontario's experience with and access to services such as the Blue Box program will never be negatively impacted. To ensure a smooth and orderly transition, Bill 151 would allow the existing waste diversion program to continue until they are transitioned to new ones. Mr. Speaker, specifically Bill 151 would set clear roles and responsibilities and the process for transition. The Minister of Environment and Climate Change would provide clear direction on how the transition would be undertaken. Working with stakeholders, each industry funding organization would develop and implement a wind-up plan for its own program and itself. The new Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority would approve and oversee the implementation of the wind-up plan to ensure the minister's direction is followed and to mitigate the risk of any interruption in services. Mr. Speaker, if Bill 151 is passed, we will be also working extensively with all relevant parties, including the existing industry, funding organizations, producers, municipalities, waste management providers, and the public on how to make this transition as seamless, as efficient as possible, without disruption to program services or funding. The strategy for waste-free Ontario, building the circular economy, would provide a roadmap for transitioning to the existing programs. If the proposed legislation is passed, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change anticipates the transition of the municipal hazardous or special waste, waste electrical and electronic equipment, and used tire programs could be complete within 2 to 4 years. However, the transition of Blue Box program may take longer as government, municipalities, and producers would need to discuss the transition process extensively to ensure residents continue to receive convenient and accessible collection services. Now I would like to talk about transition of Blue Box program, Mr. Speaker, and its transition under the proposed legislation. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, Ontario is recognized internationally for our recycling programs, and the Blue Box system is a key contributor for reducing waste in Ontario, while providing households with a convenient way to recycle their printed paper and packaging. A remarkable 97% of households in the province have convenient access to these programs. And this legislation, if passed, would ensure that everyone, whether in southern Ontario or in northern Ontario, in urban or rural areas, they would have the same level of convenient access to the Blue Box services that they have today. And the proposed new oversight body, the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority, would be responsible for enforcing these service standards. Mr. Speaker, I want to ensure all members that the government would only transition the Blue Box program to the new producer responsibility framework when producers are fully ready to deliver Blue Box services based on standards set by the government. I would also like to touch on organic waste diversion. As I said earlier, that our strategy includes a plan to increase diversion of organic waste. Organic waste such as food, leaves, yard waste makes up about 1/3 of Ontario's waste stream. Much of this material still ends up, Mr. Speaker, in landfills. Keeping organic waste out of landfills ensures valuable nutrients are recovered, and it will help reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Addressing organic waste will require a coordination among multiple players, including households, waste service providers, restaurants, food manufacturers, retailers, and food distributors. That is why our draft strategy makes it clear that the development of organic action plan would be steered by a stakeholder working group to coordinate efforts and identify the best tools to move forward. Mr. Speaker, I have talked about how the proposed legislation and strategy would address the Blue Box program and organic waste. Now, I would like to turn to industrial, commercial, and institutional waste. As I noted earlier, Ontario's current overall waste diversion rate is about 25%. But for the industrial, commercial, and institutional sectors, the rate is only, Mr. Speaker, 13%. The proposed legislation and draft strategy would provide a number of tools to increase diversion in these sectors. More materials would be designated under the new producer responsibility approach. We would require more waste generated in industrial facilities, commercial establishments, and institutional buildings to be diverted. And our organic action plan and disposal ban would also assist with diverting more waste from those sectors. Mr. Speaker, we recognize some companies' extensive effort in increasing diversion. Our draft strategy seeks to develop markets for materials and would support behaviors that reduce waste materials before they are generated. As I was talking about industrial, commercial, and institutional waste, Mr. Speaker, last year I had the opportunity to visit a school. Some institutions are doing on their own. It was an elementary school, and the name of the school is St. John Bosco School. The students collected 730 kilograms of batteries, more than any other school in the province, because they strongly believe that recycling batteries protects our natural environment. I would like to congratulate all the students of elementary school of St. John Bosco for doing such a great work, though they were doing it with the help of an NGO, Earth Rangers. Mr. Speaker, in preparing the proposed legislation, Ontario looked to other jurisdictions. We didn't do it in a vacuum, which have started to move toward a circular economy already. They are implementing producer responsibility, approaches, and other targeted measures to manage waste. We found that those jurisdictions that measure and invest in the effective use of their resources not only reduce waste but also improve their economic output. For example, Quebec's residual materials management policy sets out actions, timelines, and targets related to waste diversion in the residential, industrial, commercial, and institutional sectors. Their approach includes producer responsibility, landfill bans, and landfill levy to fund waste diversion initiatives and new infrastructure. British Columbia has implemented producer responsibility approaches for a number of types of waste, including a program for residential packaging and printed paper. Disposal bans have also been used at the provincial level in British Columbia for beverage containers and, Mr. Speaker, at the regional level for a number of additional materials, including organic waste in Metro Vancouver and Nanaimo. California has set a goal of 75% recycling, composting, or reduction by 2020. And the state has implemented a range of initiatives to achieve that goal. Producer responsibility, again, the same model, voluntary and government-run programs, as well as retail take-back programs are in place, supported by source separation requirement and landfill bans. In Europe, Austria, and the Netherlands have achieved or exceeded, Mr. Speaker, recycling targets by implementing a range of policy tools to increase resource recovery. These include producer responsibility, which we are going to adopt if this legislation is passed, disposal bans, and voluntary agreements. Germany has achieved a 40% increase in resource productivity since 2000 and reduced its domestic material consumption. Producer responsibility is applied to a number of waste materials almost by all those jurisdictions, such as packaging and household hazard waste. Ontario's proposed legislation, Mr. Speaker, and our strategy for a waste-free Ontario builds on the experience of these and other jurisdictions. And we are looking to all those jurisdictions, what they have done and how we can adopt those programs. And Mr. Speaker, Bill 151, as I said earlier, it will not only be a good for our environment, it will also recover resources, reduce waste, while it will be supporting our climate change strategy and help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as creates jobs in that sector. So I don't see any downside to this bill. It's a win-win situation. And Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to support this bill, which is a good for the economy, good for everything. It would boost the economy and create conditions to recover more waste materials and create more jobs. So I encourage all members of this House to swiftly get this bill passed so that all the players in the industry can benefit from it. And I will be very pleased to support this bill. Thank you.